So hi, everyone. Welcome to the final session of our Plan B, What to Do After the PhD series that we've been running here at the University of Porto, the Department of Comparative Literature. Today, my guest is Lola San Martín Arbide from the University of Sevilla. I'm going to just make a brief introduction and then we'll jump right into the conversation. So Lola is currently an Emergia Distinguished Research Fellow in Music at the University of Sevilla in Spain. She has previously held research positions at the NEC in Bucharest, at EHESS in Paris, the University of Oxford, and the Universidad of País Vasco in Bilbao. She earned her doctorate from the University of Salamanca, and her interests range from the cultural history of music since the 19th century to music and literature and the visual arts, sound and space, and nostalgia. So welcome, Lola. I'm just going to read, I'm just going to highlight a couple of your recent publications as well. And we can go. So first of all, you did, and this was the presentation that I saw you doing back at the time. You did your dissertation on Eric Satie and Brian Eno, right? So this was something you concluded in 2013, right? So Lola has a doctorate in musicology from the University of Salamanca, and the title of her dissertation was From Eric Satie to Brian Eno, Ambient Music in the 20th Century as a Reflection on the City, the Visual and the Oral. Then she is currently, and this is probably something that we're going to talk about, she's currently working on a book called The City of Sound, Village of Song, Listening to Paris in Literature, Film and Music, 1870 to 1939. And we'll talk about this book. I'm sure she's also working on a bunch of articles and chapters, one called Situationist Music, Walter Olmos Pioneering Musica Ambientale, Pierre McOrlin and the Musical Comeback of the Belle Époque in the Second World War, France, and Sonic Borders, Nationalism, and Oral Mapping of Spain. So these are some of the, and you have two more that are more recent. Singing the City, Song, Literature, and Popular Culture of Paris. And finally, Fashionable Legitimacy, Lessig, and the French Middle Ground, right? Then Lola has also a forthcoming chapter called Beyond Paris in the Cambridge University Press book called Debussy in Context. And I'll just draw attention to one article of hers on Eric Satie's Mise en Scène, Uniforms and the Self-Image of a Composer in Turn of the Century Paris, which came out in the Journal of Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture, right? So this allows me to ask you something about your dissertation, which is usually how I've been starting these conversations anyway, right? So you, can you tell us a little bit about why and how you decided to write your dissertation on Eric Satie and Brian Eno, right? Was this a project that you had already started developing during your MA, or was this something that you started working on for a seminar paper or something like that? How did this project come about? Can you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and it's great to be here. And I hope that together we'll manage to raise some points that will be of interest to everyone who's joining us and watching. So my PhD project, you mentioned my MA, so maybe I should explain what was what and how it all happened. I was reflecting on this earlier as I was thinking about our future conversation in the afternoon, and I just remembered how when I was a fourth year undergrad student in music and musicology at the University of Salamanca, a lecturer who then became my doctoral supervisor recruited me to be the secretary at an international conference. And at the time, yes, I had been to that conference before, to a previous edition, when I was still a translation and interpreting student. And I went to this conference. I really enjoyed it. I was fascinated by the papers and the people I met. And so I went to talk to this lecturer and proposed whether she would help me navigate a change of curriculum. And that's how I gave up translation, which I eventually completed, but for a time I gave it up and I took up my studies in music. And so when this second or follow-up edition of the same conference took place, this lecturer recruited me to help her with the organization. And that's how I became part of this community of film music scholars. And that's why my MA thesis was about film music. It was about filmmaker Jim Jarmusch and the music of his films. He's a notorious and very well known and very much appreciated for having a very unique sonic atmosphere, being a musician himself, and he often casts musicians as actors in his films. So it was a really interesting project. And it was such a surprise to be put in that context of research. And I feel like maybe my thesis supervisor, when I came to her to say I was ready to embark on a doctoral project, I feel like her reaction, her name, by the way, is Professor Matilde from the University of Salamanca. And I think somehow she already knew and she was waiting for me to say it out loud, but it had been, I think, in the coming since my last year, at least, of undergrad studies when I presented my first paper at this film music conference. So I completed that MA. And then when I was brainstorming ideas for a PhD, she was my person that I would go to with, to bounce things off and see if they worked or not. And she was very enthusiastic. She put me in touch with some young scholars that I really admired, that were very positive role models for me. And it was through conversations with them that I ended up narrowing down my project, which was about, like you said, and thank you, that was a very generous introduction. That's how I narrowed down my project on ambient music. And of course, that first narrowing down was very loose. And then the following 4 years were dedicated to a large extent to further narrowing down that first idea. But it was, I think she did what a good supervisor does, which is to let you talk and help you put your ideas in order and extract from them what is valuable and help you find orientation within your own thoughts. And that's how we embarked on this project together. It was a very ambitious PhD in that it was very broad in terms of time frame. It covered almost the entire 20th century, and geographically and thematically too, it was very broad. So that was a big challenge. It was a source of satisfaction when I began to see that the entire thing was taking shape and that things were falling into place. But it was also a source of criticism, because in some seminars I gave where I explained my project throughout the 4 years, some lecturers and senior researchers expressed concern that it was unmanageable, that it was too broad, and that there wasn't a tight core to it. And all along I was thinking, no, let me finish. I promise I'll try. I can't promise I'll succeed, but please allow me to finish, and hopefully when it's done, you'll be able to see it's solid, it's coherent. And funnily enough, when the moment for my viva came, one lecturer said I had done a better job at explaining the thesis orally, and that connecting thread was more clear as I talked through it than it was in the written form of the thesis. Well, yeah, anyway, it's just an anecdote or a remark that has come to mind.
And then, so about that project still, right? Did you later on decide to I read, as I was reading your CV earlier, right? I mentioned that you did publish an essay on Eric Satie, right? It was one of your I think important publications that you had highlighted there, right? But did you decide to not publish this project as a book, or did you like, because you were talking about whether it was manageable, whether it was coherent, did you ultimately decide that it worked better in individual articles, or are you still working on this in your dissertation, right? Yeah. As a book project?
I published two articles, I think, and a couple, I don't know, 2 or 3 book chapters that were extracted from that very much correlated with thesis chapters. And it happened very naturally, very spontaneously. The articles, one was purely my initiative because I saw a call for articles and I decided to respond to it and propose an article. The other one was an invitation for a special guest issue. And the book chapters were results of conferences where I had presented the material. And I never envisioned either publishing a book or publishing as separate items. It happened very naturally over the course of 4 or 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. Now, how can I say, looking back, I often think, how have I come so far with so little knowledge and so little strategy? Because this is really dependent on the context. In Spain, like we were saying just before this conversation went live, it may not be non-negotiable criteria to get a first job in academia at a university to have published a monograph. But as we know in other contexts, in the UK, in the US, it's pretty much the rite of passage, right, into intellectual adulthood after a PhD. And because I've had quite a nomadic path throughout my studies and my first jobs, it's been very confusing sometimes. And when I first arrived with my first postdoc to the UK, I really thought, what have I done? I should have put some energy into publishing the thesis as a book, because now I'm stuck. I don't have any feasible book projects in the short term, and this is what I need to promote. And I didn't know whether I would get a job in Spain, so that was very confusing, and it felt like at times I was making mistakes that would have long-lasting negative consequences. Gladly, I can now say that none of that happened, and that there's always a way back and ways to make amendments and find alternative paths, and that there's no one single way to manage your thesis publications. But I do wish that I had, on the one hand, I do wish I had a more precise strategy and knowledge about all of the practicalities and the procedural aspects that I didn't really want to get my hands dirty with, because it's not the exciting thing about being an academic, is it? And on the other hand, I'm glad I didn't, because in the end it worked out and I got away with not thinking too much in utilitarian terms about my own publications. And I published whenever I felt like it was something I could enjoy, when I was happy to collaborate with colleagues that created a positive ambience for us to make something collectively. And it's only recently that I need to really set some priorities and stick to them in terms of publications. Now that I have perhaps the promise of a permanent job in the near future, this is when things get real. But until now, I've really managed to be quite free and quite, to publish at will rather than by any imposed guidelines or any imposed do's and don'ts.
Yeah, that's very nice, right? And it's true that, I mean, I speak for myself. I also didn't really, like, coming out of the PhD, didn't really have or didn't spend much time thinking about like whether I was going to publish the dissertation as a book or as individual chapters. It just, as you were sort of suggesting, it just ended up the way it ended up happening was that, yes, I ended up also publishing, a chapter here, an article here, an article there. And it is true, though, that may be helpful anyway, right? To get you started on at least a postdoc, right? At least a first level position, right? In which, as you were saying, you may not need a book, right? But you need to have publications, right? And those publications are very likely going to come out of your dissertation, which is what you've been working on for a long time anyway, right? So it is a very natural, I think, trajectory, I think. Although, as you were suggesting, it may not be the standard way of doing things in maybe the United States or in the UK, right? In which you really should be thinking about getting your first book out.
Yes.
Right.
I didn't, there's also an emotional element. Once I was done with the thesis, in the immediate ensuing future, I didn't want to think about it. I really wanted to leave it behind. Because I find working with old drafts to be very heavy and deadening to me. And I like to, this is what I like versus what I should be doing. I like to move on to new things that excite me, that I feel enthusiastic about. Whereas the drafts that are already written, they are done to me, and I see no interest in extracting further and further outputs from them. I'm not very good maybe at exploiting a research piece in multiple ways because I like to move on to the next thing. So, but I do see that some of my colleagues who at the time were probably thinking this way, and okay, I want to get here, how do I get here? And they were a lot more strategic and a lot cleverer than me. They got there way earlier than I did and have had a permanent position for years now, whereas I didn't. And then a note about the issue of when you move to a new country. A professor once told me that in the UK, when a CV comes from someone from Spain or from France, or I guess from Portugal, Italy, that something that strikes them is the amount of publications that we tend to have. And this person was saying that in the UK, the perfect standard is to end your thesis with maybe 1 or 2 prestigious articles, whereas like I did, at the end of my thesis, I had a handful of book chapters that in the UK wouldn't give you many stars in the ref system.
Yeah.
And they said, when a CV from Spain comes to a jury for a teaching position, they would, and this was specific to this person, I don't mean to imply this is the rule, but at least in this case, this person said they would tend to lower the points they give, because these books of mine, or people like me who have a similar profile to mine, are not really in their system. So I mean that publications and prestige and all of those things get lost in international moves. And so it's very hard to stay relevant across a number of countries. And in my case, I genuinely didn't know where I wanted to secure a position in the future. So really, I was for a certain period of time, I was very much clueless as to what to prioritize. Should I write a monograph? Should I do my article? Should I do my book chapters? I didn't know. I didn't know. And that really confused me for some time. And until I came to the conclusion that I should do what fulfills me and what I think is a good outcome in its own terms without thinking where would it lead me. And eventually, luckily for me, it did lead me to get new and to be able to sustain employment in postdocs until this point.
Very nice. One thing I wanted to ask you about, I mean, since we're talking about exploiting previous work, I wanted to ask you, did you end up doing anything with your work on Jim Jarmusch, right? That you did, that you developed for your MA, right? Because one thing I noticed that let me add is that, like for example, now I'm teaching a course to MA students, right? And one thing I do tell them or do advise them to do is that, you know, don't think of these papers that you're writing for our seminars as just, you know, things you're just going to throw away or to just get the grade or something like that. You know, think about them as a conference presentation or an article, right? And it is, I find myself saying this because I ended up, so for example, the work that I presented at the conference where I met you, right? So you were presenting on Eric Satie and Brian Eno. I was doing at the time my MA thesis on Captain Beefheart, which I ended up publishing much later, right? Almost like 10 years later as an article, right? So I did end up mining, as we were saying, mining my own research for publications, right? And but I do think it makes sense, right? It is a work that I was happy with, so I wanted to get it to a nice venue. So I don't know. Did you end up?
I ended up, I think, by browsing websites or keeping an eye on distribution lists. I found two other scholars who were at the same time working on music in Jarmusch filmography, and so some years afterwards, I got in touch with them and proposed we should host a panel at a conference, the same film music conference that I keep coming back to. And we did that, and out of that came out a book. So I published a book chapter on yeah, which was just a small part of the thesis. But there's that. That's something.
But that's but that's very nice, right? That you were.
Yeah. And then
yeah.
There are a number of papers that I wrote for conferences that I never got around to publishing.
Mm-hmm.
Some you mentioned in the introduction as works that are there are works in progress, but there are some that aren't even on that list that I have. I'm just not a very fast writer, and I tend to hoard my own drafts before I feel confident to publish them. And so this is a problem, I think, that I end up having too many works in progress at the same time, too many for my own good, that I find difficulty managing all of them together. And so the result is that some of them end up at the very back of a drawer, almost forgotten for years and years. But eventually I hope I will come back to them and finish them.
Yeah, but in any case, right, like going to conferences is rewarding. I mean, which we now are maybe able to do again this year.
Of course, I was just.
So it's rewarding, just in itself as well. So,
yes.
So that's really cool. And Yeah, that brings me to something that I wanted to ask you about, which is collaborations. But let me first ask you to develop something you said earlier about mentorship, right? And the importance that your advisor, right, your mentor had in the way that you developed your project, right? So this is something that I feel that most people sort of, don't question, right, or just assume that they're kind of stuck with, if they have a mediocre or a bad mentor, or not the mentor that they would like to have, right? They feel that they may be stuck with the mentor that they have, right? But then, as we know, right, like going into the postdoc job market, right, and finding and having the also the responsibility, I guess, to finding your own mentor, right, to start a new project, right, which I believe you did at the different postdocs that you did in Oxford and in Paris, right? Could you talk a little bit about how you decided to pick particular people to supervise particular projects of yours, and how that was important in how those projects developed?
Sure. So it was very much a gut. I followed my gut. For example, I remember, and this book came out in conversations at the conference I was at last week. One of my top 3 or so books that I've ever read on music, written by a musicologist or music historian, is by Robert Fink, about minimalism. It's called Repeating Ourselves. And when I was reading it, I thought, this is so relevant, such a rich source for my thesis. And I really felt like if I didn't get this person's feedback, my thesis wouldn't have any value, because from that book, I could really feel like I should hear him on my project. And I read the book, felt that way, and I emailed him. And some months later, I was in Los Angeles, in UCLA, doing a research stay. And that's pretty much the way I found my mentors, through their books. Same way with Esteban Buch in Paris, and with Daniel Brimley in Oxford. And I let them know when I contacted them. It wasn't through my doctoral supervisor. I fabricated this myself out of my readings that had really affected me, and that had really impacted my research, and that had really deepened my horizons intellectually. And when I first got in touch with them, no one really facilitated. There wasn't any mediation. It was out of the blue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in most cases, I let them know. So I read this piece by you, and I've been incorporating your insights into my research, which is about this and that. And I would like to know if you'd be interested in hosting my project for a small amount of time or a large amount of time. That's how I went about it. There were I think just on one occasion it didn't work. I would say, in my experience, definitely the large majority of people are actually quite welcoming, very welcoming actually,
Mm-hmm.
and very pleased to receive that sort of out of the blue admiration of someone telling, I love your work so much, I would like to work with you.
No, that's wonderful, and that's very nice. It's very nice that you're saying it, because I feel that, especially over here, working with junior researchers, right? It's the people that are still in their PhD. The mentality, I feel, is that you cannot approach a senior scholar and do the sort of thing that you were saying, right? Like either ask the person if she'd be interested in being your supervisor, or even asking if the person wants to submit a chapter, right, for a conference, or even invite. So one thing I feel that I recently organized a conference with some friends of mine, and they were initially very reluctant to invite top scholars from big schools because they felt that they just wouldn't accept, right? Like why would they accept our invitation to come to Portugal? We're so insignificant, we're so small, no one's really going to care about us, right? But that's not the case, right? People are generally, as you were saying, right, like eager for that sort of those sorts of conversations, or eager to engage with other people's work if it's relevant, of course, right? Provided that there is a genuine connection between what they're doing. So that's
who doesn't like an invite?
Yeah, of course.
They're free to reject it, or they might be on a sabbatical or have any reason not to accept, but the invitation is there, and I think everyone likes an invitation, or to know that their work has reached someone in a country. Like you say, oh, we're irrelevant in Portugal. I don't think so. I mean, who doesn't like to know their work has reached across oceans and mountains and has interested someone enough that they would reach out?
Yeah, no, but it is still a very parochial, you could say a very parochial culture, right? In which you're only supposed to invite people, to be keynotes at conferences if they're like, over here, right? If they're in Portugal, or they're even part of the university or something like that. But so it's still very, we're gonna say, no, we're gonna say something.
I was gonna say that, sure, that's a very valid critique, but the same, because we're like, I sense that in this conversation there's like we and them kind of way of thinking, like we in the smaller academic cultures and them in the large, I assume, Anglophone universities. And we do invite, I'm gonna just speak for myself, I do invite the star scholars to come to our events. And I think it's happening more and more that over there, they also invite smaller. But that's not the way to think about it. They're not smaller in any shape or form. So of course, language is a barrier. But it'd be good, because sometimes I've experienced the same, in Oxford, you can only invite keynotes from near Oxford or big US universities. And it takes some character to actually our keynote is going to be from Seville or from Porto or from Cremona, from wherever. So it should go both ways.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's true.
Because we are talking in English when we're neighbors from Iberian Peninsula. So.
No, and it is true that maybe the kind of as we were saying, right, the kind of ranking systems that we now sort of guide ourselves by, right, both in Spain and here, are not really that important, I think, overseas, right? Like we tend to maybe, I think even the question of rankings is not really a thing in the States, at least. Like when I was doing my PhD, no one was talking about rankings and you should send your paper to this or that journal, right? I think that's ironically more of a European thing, that we assume that we sort of have to publish in that way, right? But I don't think that that people, at least across the ocean, think in those terms, pay particular attention to those things. But yeah, so another thing I wanted to ask you about, since we mentioned mentorships, we talked about conferences and going to conferences, and you mentioned at least during our conversation already, a bunch of projects that started by meeting people at particular places and doing things with them. So I wanted to ask you about collaborations, right? Is like writing collaboratively, or thinking, or putting a project together collaboratively, something that that you have done like a lot over the years that you feel is important for also the way that your research has developed, and just whether it's part of your praxis, I guess, right? Like, and do you like it? Do you like doing it? Do you feel that it's rewarding and rewarded by like whatever ranking systems or publication criteria we were talking about before?
Well, absolutely. It is certainly one of my favorite things about the job is hosting, meeting people, staying late in conference dinners, the social part of it. I really enjoy it, and it's likely that's one of the reasons why I went into academia in the first place. And it's genuinely a pleasure to meet people and socialize and have a network of nice colleagues. And certainly some of my the high points that I consider are my achievements in my CV have come out of these happy encounters where I would go to a conference and meet someone, and then months later receiving an invite to write for a collective volume, or I'll be invited to, and I will invite back, of course, to join the committee of a conference, to be in a research team together. And that really provides some structure. It provides like safety net where you feel like your work is relevant because it most certainly fits into a wider, more ambitious project than you would be able to pull individually. In that sense, for example, there was a very successful group experience was a project about Bizet's opera Carmen, or Carmen in French. That came out, so I was invited because I met the principal investigators at a conference, and we talked about it very informally, me being from Spain and the opera being set in Seville. I wasn't working here at all then, but it made sense to talk about it. And I was first asked, would you know this about this opera? Very informally, not at all as a member of the project. And with time, I ended up carrying out enough research for them to say, well, you do seem like one of us now. You should formally join the project because you've been working on this. And so I went to a conference, then I think there was a second conference, then there was a book by Cambridge University Press where I published a chapter. Then I presented that at a conference in Spain, and that got me another invitation to write about Carmen for another book, which this time I wrote for hands with one of the principal investigators of the project, and we published together in French, which was one of those moments when you think, yes, I like what I'm doing. I was very proud to have written with her, with Claire Rowden from Cardiff University, in a book that was edited by, again, professors that I hold high esteem. And then I had written that, so I was invited to a round table, and eventually Welsh National Opera invited me to write for their program. So it was like a very productive, very happy snowball that kept growing and growing. And now I work at the university where it all happens. So I'm surrounded by Carmen, and people listening to us may not know this, but the tobacco factory where the story happens, the plot happens, is now the historical building of the University of Sevilla.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yes.
No, but that, that's a very interesting like snowball effect, as you said, right? Like that it keeps on giving. That's those sorts of connections keep sort of reinforcing.
It kept on giving because it was very well managed and was very the leadership of the project was great, and there was a very nice vibe between everyone that collaborated.
No, and you know, and that's, as you said, right? Like that I think is key. Like that is one thing that is why you're here for, right? Like to do these things with people, and then these are the things that sort of energize us and motivate us to do work. So even if, I mean, as you didn't say this, but it might very well be the case that, you know, those things might not necessarily lead to like high prestige publications, or right? It did in this case, right? Like as you said, right? Like, but yeah, just the fact of you know, working with other people and building those relationships that might lead to interesting projects down the line, right? Not necessarily in the, you know, on more immediate terms, right? Is motivating, I think. And did you? So this leads me also to the like question that I normally ask people about writing practices, right? Do you normally use these contacts to also just write together, or did you have like a writing group, for example, either in Paris or in Oxford or something like that, or were you always more the kind of person that would just write by yourself and was motivated in that way? Anyway, right? So tell us a little bit about.
Most of the time I write on my own, as I think most people do. There was that successful experience of writing in collaboration with a professor, and that was fantastic because I think she motivated me more than I motivated her, but she was very prolific, very fast, very efficient. So we were working remotely from Cardiff and Paris, and she would work on the draft, send it to me, and I knew she was waiting, so I had to react fast, and we wrote very it was a very vivid rhythm, very intense, and we wrote the chapter quite fast, also because it was a well-known topic for the both of us. But that was a very invigorating experience, very refreshing, and it made me feel very able, you know, because we managed to complete it successfully without much hassle. It went very smooth, very well. So that was great. Then in terms of writing groups, there was writing sessions at the music faculty in Oxford for doctoral students, and I joined. When I arrived, I joined those sessions for some time, then I gradually stopped going. We would look at a paragraph or something that someone had submitted, like you do in writing groups, and we would give each other feedback and think about recurrent mistakes or strategies and this sort of thing. But most of the time I write on my own. And when I was starting my PhD, I was very much the type of person who thinks through writing, and I would end up with very long drafts, and I had no problem whatsoever in deleting an entire paragraph, an entire page, because when I was writing, I knew it was all very, well, it was just a sketch. And the more and more I work, the more I try to have a much clearer, now I try to have as clear of a vision as possible of what I work on the page. And I am not as comfortable deleting paragraphs. So I try to polish things a lot more before I put them on the page. And to that end, I have come up with a method that so far works. I'm hoping I'll keep improving it, but what I do is I'll compile a folder for each project, and I have different Word files. So I'll have, I don't use bibliography management apps. Everybody tells me I should, but I've never really, I can't really put in the effort of the first familiarizing myself with Word. I think there's no time for that. I'll do on my Google Word file, and that'll do. So I have my bibliography, then I have my extracted bibliography and archival notes and materials, so that when I go to a smaller library or an archive, I know what's where and what can I check out while I'm at a certain site. And then I have some other documents that I always create for each project. One is called timeline, and that allows me to organize in a temporal sequence all of the artworks, events, points of reference that I want to be able to see clearly, so that my then when I write, it all falls very smoothly into place. And I always have one of those documents for each piece. Then I have the notes file, which can be as long as several hundreds of pages. And there I will extract my comments and reflections and quotes from secondary literature, and also my analysis and what I've worked on with primary sources. And then I always have another separate document, which is called structure, where I write in order the words, concepts, and small sentences that summarize what each paragraph should be about. And that document helps me make sure that I don't digress or divert or stray away, do you say, from the line of argument that I want to be clear when a reader reads my texts. And then when I actually start working on the draft, I will always have at least one word or one short sentence in bold letters in each paragraph, so that when I look at it at a glance, I can see my line of thought and the thread that connects. And this is all out of some chaos I created with my dissertation. I learned from my mistakes, and at one point I had the thesis printed out, and I was literally moving pages backwards and forwards, and in the end it was all a big mess. So I now try to avoid that by really securing each item of information to its place before I work on my prose, so that the information is very solid.
And very interesting how that shift, right? Like how you started out as many of us. I mean, I don't do that, right? But I know a lot of friends of mine that that work in precisely that way, right? They work on a little bit on the introduction and then a little bit on the conclusion at the same time, and they're writing all these paragraphs, simultaneously, which is always sounded like very chaotic to me, right? Like I never did that, right? Like I always have a hard time like getting things to the page, right? Like and I do like to start with precisely, I think, with what you were suggesting, right? Like an outline, right, or a very precise structure as to how I want my argument to develop, right? So I used to do that. I don't think I am as rigid anymore. So I'm going in the opposite way, I believe, right?
Well, like you say, writing not in the order might work if you have that outline, because you know what's going to be in the middle, that it helps me sometimes write different sections. If I've already decided what's going to go where, then I can work on the writing. Yeah.
And do you tend to write, like, at least when because I believe that now you're going to start having like heavier teaching responsibilities, but when you had more time, did you write every day, or try to write every day, or force yourself to write every day, or
yes,
none of that? Yes,
I did force myself. And at times when I was under a tight deadline, I would even, and this felt like punishment to an extent, but I did have a word count, and I said, I'm not leaving my desk until I've reached this number of words. And it's a hard thing to do. Writing is not easy. I don't think most people don't find it easy. I don't think. So it can be difficult and enjoyable. One doesn't deter from the other. Right. But yeah, when during periods of intense writing, I write every day, and maybe in a month and a half, 2 months, I will have my 40-page draft or something like that. Because right now I'm working on quite long book chapters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe before we close, let me ask you about the book project, right? Because we started the conversation with precisely how you had not planned to write a or to extract a book from your dissertation, but now you do have a book project that you, I believe, developed maybe while you were in Paris. So can you say a little bit about how you arrived at that idea and
So I started that project in Oxford. Because one of the questions you sent me previously to think about was, how do you make sure, or how do you try to ensure that a proposal is going to be successful? And what I did was very much tailor. I never wrote a proposal and then submitted to several bodies hoping one would fund it. I always had a very clear vision of a target of, this is the one fellowship I would pretty much kill for. And so I would very carefully study what that scheme was about, the guidelines, the policy documents that go with it. I would do a very thorough, and then target and tailor my proposal to that specific call. And because the call is interesting, not for the sake of being so legal about things or so precise. Right. In this case, there was this scheme that I really wanted to take part in that was all about connecting research groups from two different countries, and it was funded by the Basque government, and that's how I ended up getting a fellowship that connected Oxford University with the University of the Basque Country. And I had my task as a potential funded researcher was to create a bridge between two existing groups. And so I found the groups that aligned to my interests. One was about music and landscape and sonic ecology, and the other one was about urban culture and had more of a focus on film. So I knew, okay, these are my two pillars, and I now have to build a roof that will connect both of them. What is the work that is, of course, relevant to my interest, but could also potentially be of interest to people in these groups? And so I came up with this project about Parisian soundscapes and song and cultural geography. And it did feel awkward at times to be working on French sources as a Spanish researcher in the UK. And I did think, what am I doing? This makes no sense. So that's why I then applied for a Marie Curie position in France. So that has been written across both fellowships. Then my Marie Curie was very much, it was stopped and disturbed by the pandemic. Right. And that's why this project has been going on for so long. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to jinx it, but it was also at a conference that the book became more of a tangible, maybe reality, because someone approached me and proposed whether I would like to submit a proposal. And like you said at the beginning about, well, we don't, in this smaller countries, we don't really dare inviting the big names. As a recent PhD from Spain, it's like I didn't even dare to think myself as someone who could write a monograph in English. And it was when I went to Oxford that I thought, well, everyone is doing it, why shouldn't I be able to do this too? And that's when because my original project was about writing articles, and I was going to write 2 or 3 articles in those 3 years. And then when I arrived, I changed my mind and I thought, no, this should be a book. Let me write a book. And it's been going on ever since. And that's what I'm writing these long chapters for.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Oh, it's still going, the review process, right? You're still waiting.
I'm still writing. I need to go through the first review. It's still very early stages. You know, it was delayed by the pandemic, some other health problems, but I'm coming back at it now with the new job in Seville. It's like, you know, after the pandemic and problems. Now it's like the time when I'm coming back to academic life with full energy and full force.
Wonderful. Just then a final a question for you, Lola, which is what I normally ask, like, would you have done things differently had you known like this or that you now know being a postdoc, right? Like looking back, right? Like retrospectively as a PhD student or as a recent PhD, what would you have done differently, right? Like if you had known any better, yes, if you had more information at your disposal.
I would have perhaps devoted more time to learning about what I think is the boring side of university life. The policy issues, the accreditation system, learning more about journal rankings, because those matter a lot here. And I got away with ignoring all of that for so long. And that would have been very practical to have. But I don't know, had you asked me this a year and a half ago, I probably would say I would do everything differently. But then I got this Seville fellowship, and all of a sudden, all of my worries from back then don't matter anymore because I did secure another job. But there was a time, maybe 2 years ago or so, when I thought, how have I gotten myself into this deep rabbit hole? How on earth do I get back? How do I get out of it? Because I felt like I had some experience in Spain, some in the UK, some in France, but I wasn't really rooted anywhere. I wasn't seen as a full peer anywhere because I was always the person who had just arrived or the person who was just about to leave. And it was very hard to know if I had made my life too complicated for my own good. Now it all seems irrelevant, but I would have a very different answer if you asked me some time ago. Now I'm quite happy that I managed to leave my 20s, the beginning of my 30s in a very free-spirited way, contacting professors out of the blue saying, can I move to LA? Can I move to Paris? Can I move to Oxford? It all working. It really makes for I'm quite, that is the richness that I have accumulated. That's my heritage, it's what I've done, what I've decided to invest in. And I'm very happy I did, but it got to a point where it got too much. So I'm very pleased that I have this employment back in my country. That allows me to put some order back where I had lost all kind of sense of orientation. And I'm sure any mobile researcher, nomadic postdoc will relate to this.
I am sure that, but it is very difficult to plan ahead. Like even if you, as you were saying, right? Like even if you had planned ahead, and had known more about rankings and whatnot. So the reason also why I ask these questions is because I precisely suspect that a lot of PhD students don't care about those things, right? So that was the impression. It's the impression I still have now, actually, right? Like, but from like talking to people, I think people are very focused, right? Almost very narrowly focused on their dissertation, right? And they are sort of ignoring these more practical things that become very important when you're on the job market, right? And you find yourself drifting as you were describing, right? Like between not knowing exactly what you should be investing in or what you should have invested in. So sort of I guess the main theme of these series of talks has been, you should be paying attention to these things now, right? Not later, not 2 years from now when you're, at a loss as to what to do, right? But it is difficult, right? Like I know that, all these warnings,
because it doesn't feel, it's not an attractive part of the job,
right?
You don't go I never went into a thesis project to learn about these things. I went into it to open my mindset, to read, to write, to travel, to meet people. And I think there's a time and a space for everything. And maybe it's not a problem to learn as you go. Maybe have a bit more awareness than I did. But yeah, it's like a more advanced postdoc thing than maybe at a dissertation phase where it's already enough to write a dissertation.
Fair enough. So thank you very much, Lola, for coming to chat with us, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, and I look forward to knowing about your own work in time and another occasion, and I'm very pleased. It's been very nice. Time has flown by. I can't believe it's already been an hour conversation. It's been really pleasurable, and I hope someone will get some good points from this and inspiration to keep going and to find the confidence that what they're doing is fine, you know, that there are many ways to accomplish a PhD. Yeah, and
thank you very much.
so much.
Bye.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye.